The late summer sun cast long shadows across the wooden deck of the riverboat as Jake Thompson stood at the bow, watching the muddy waters of the Missouri River churn beneath him. At 26, he cut an imposing figure in his tailored Eastern suit, though the frontier dust had already begun to settle on the fine fabric. His father William's railroad empire stretched across 3 territories, but Jake felt more at home on these working vessels than in the polished boardrooms of St. Louis. The paddle wheeler was making its way upriver to Silver City, where his father's latest expansion project awaited. The Thompson Rail Company had secured rights to lay track through the fertile valley, though Jake had heard whispers about disputed land claims and homesteader protests. His father had dismissed these concerns with his usual imperial wave of the hand, but something about this trip felt different to Jake. Sarah Miller stood on the upper deck, her gray eyes fixed on the young Thompson heir with unconcealed contempt. As the daughter of one of the valley's most prominent farming families, she had watched the railroad surveyors marking their way across her neighbor's lands with increasing alarm. The Miller farm sat right in the proposed path, and her father Samuel had already refused 2 buyout offers. The riverboat captain, James Davis, navigated the treacherous bends with practiced ease, calling out commands to his crew as they approached a particularly nasty snag. Jake admired the old riverman's quiet competence, so different from the bombastic railroadmen who surrounded his father. Davis had been working these waters for 30 years, watching the frontier transform from wilderness to settled territory. As they rounded the final bend toward Silver City, Jake caught his first glimpse of the railroad camp sprawled along the shoreline. Hundreds of workers swarmed like ants around the heavy equipment and supply wagons, while surveyors' flags marked the intended path of the iron rails. The sight should have filled him with pride, but instead he felt an unfamiliar unease. Thomas Wilson, his father's chief of security, waited at the dock with a contingent of armed men. The burly ex-lawman had served the Thompson family for years, handling the messy business of clearing right-of-ways and dealing with uncooperative landowners. Jake had never questioned Wilson's methods before, but the rifles slung across his men's shoulders told a clear story. "Welcome to Silver City, Mr. Thompson," Wilson said as Jake descended the gangplank. "Your father sent word to proceed with the evictions immediately. We've got crews standing by." His voice held no emotion, as if discussing the weather rather than forcing families from their homes. Jake felt his stomach tighten but nodded curtly, following Wilson toward the waiting horses. They rode out at dawn the next morning, a long column of armed men and wagons raising dust across the valley floor. Jake watched from horseback as they approached the first homestead, where a weather-beaten man stood in his doorway clutching an ancient shotgun. His wife and children huddled behind him, terror evident in their faces as Wilson's men surrounded the cabin. What happened next would haunt Jake's dreams for years to come. The family's resistance crumbled in minutes against Wilson's overwhelming force. As the children screamed and the mother wept, the men systematically demolished the cabin, tossing furniture and possessions into the dirt. Jake sat frozen in his saddle, shame burning in his chest as he witnessed his family's legacy of progress revealed as naked brutality. Sarah Miller watched from a distant hillside, tears streaming down her face as her neighbors' lives were destroyed. She recognized Jake Thompson among the riders and felt her hatred crystallize into something harder and colder. The railroad men moved methodically from farm to farm, leaving broken homes and shattered dreams in their wake. By sunset, the valley echoed with the sound of splintering wood and human anguish. That night, Jake paced his hotel room in Silver City, unable to shake the images of the day's violence. His father's voice echoed in his head, lecturing about manifest destiny and the march of civilization. But all Jake could see were those children's faces as their world was torn apart. When a rock crashed through his window, he found a note wrapped around it. "Meeting at Miller's barn. Midnight. Come alone if you want to help." The decision that had been building all day crystallized in that moment. Jake knew crossing his father would mean sacrificing his inheritance and possibly his life, but he could no longer be part of this destruction. Donning simple clothes, he slipped out into the darkness, leaving behind the weight of the Thompson name and everything it had come to represent. The Miller barn stood dark against the starlit sky as Jake approached on foot. He could make out shadowy figures moving inside, and his hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip. But as he stepped through the door, the sight that greeted him drove all thoughts of violence from his mind. Dozens of faces turned to stare at him. Farmers, workers, rivermen, even some of the railroad's own employees, all gathered in desperate solidarity. Samuel Miller stepped forward, his weathered face illuminated by lantern light. "Didn't expect to see William Thompson's son here," he said quietly, "though Sarah told me you looked sick watching Wilson's work today." The assembled crowd muttered darkly at the mention of the security chief's name. Jake met Miller's steady gaze and knew he had found his true inheritance, not in his father's empire of iron and greed, but in the struggle of these people to hold on to their piece of the American dream. Jake stepped further into the barn, the floorboards creaking beneath his polished boots. Boots that suddenly felt like a betrayal of the simple folk gathered here. The lantern light caught the gold watch chain at his vest, another stark reminder of the privilege he'd been born into. "Mr. Miller," he said, removing his hat, "I've come to tell you that Wilson's men plan to burn out the holdouts along River Creek tomorrow. My father signed the orders this afternoon." The news sent a ripple of angry murmurs through the crowd. Sarah Miller, Samuel's daughter, pushed through to stand beside her father, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "They can't just keep taking whatever they want," she said. "These farms have been here since before the railroad even thought about coming through." A weathered riverman Jake knew as Thomas spoke up from the back. "Ain't just the farms, neither. They're squeezing the trading posts, too, forcing us to ship everything on their terms. Used to be we could make a living moving goods between Abilene and Fort Worth. Now the railroad's got it all locked down." Jake felt the weight of every eye in the room. These people had every reason to throw him out, to see him as just another Thompson. But he'd spent the last month watching his father's empire devour everything in its path, watching families who'd worked their land for generations forced to choose between selling at ruinous prices or facing Wilson's thugs. "The railroad's not invincible," Jake said, his voice stronger now. "My father's empire is built on contracts, loans, and political favors. I know where the weak points are. I know which judges are in his pocket, which banks hold the notes, and most importantly, I know how he thinks." He turned to Samuel Miller. "If you'll have my help, I'll stand with you." The barn fell silent save for the whisper of wind through the rafters. Samuel studied Jake for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your father won't take kindly to this, boy. Once you cast your lot with us, there's no going back to that mansion in Silver City." Sarah stepped closer, her presence both challenging and encouraging. "We need someone who understands their ways," she said. "But you'll have to prove yourself. These people have lost too much to trust easily." The lamplight caught the stubborn set of her jaw, reminding Jake of the stories he'd heard about her leading the resistance against the railroad's first attempts to seize land along the river. "First thing we need is warning," Jake said, forcing himself to focus on strategy rather than Sarah's proximity. "I can get word to the families Wilson's targeting, but we'll need more than that. The railroad's strength is in its connections, banking, shipping, politics. We need to build our own network." Thomas pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning. "River folk stick together. I can spread the word from here to Tombstone. Get the traders and rivermen organized." Others began nodding, voices rising with suggestions and offers of help. Jake felt something shift inside him, like a compass finding true north. He'd spent his life preparing to take over his father's empire, learning its intricate machinery of power and profit. Now he would use that knowledge to help dismantle it, piece by carefully constructed piece. Samuel raised his hand for quiet. "Dawn's coming soon. Jake, you'll need to get back before you're missed. Sarah, show him the back way through the cottonwoods." He fixed Jake with a stern look. "Tomorrow we'll see if William Thompson's son can truly turn against his father's ways." As Jake followed Sarah into the pre-dawn darkness, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy blanket. Behind him, the assembled farmers and workers began dispersing, each carrying a spark of hope and resistance back to their homes. The war for the River Valley's soul was about to begin, and Jake Thompson had just chosen his side. The summer heat shimmered off the muddy waters of the Missouri River as Jake Thompson stood at the bow of his father's newest steamboat, the River Queen. At 25, he cut a striking figure in his tailored suit, though his weathered hands and sun-bronzed face betrayed countless hours spent learning the family's shipping business from the deck up rather than the boardroom down. His father, William Thompson's railroad and riverboat empire stretched from St. Louis to Fort Worth, but it was here in Abilene where Jake felt the weight of his inheritance most heavily. William Thompson's latest acquisition had brought them upriver to oversee the forced removal of homesteader families who'd refused to sell their valuable riverside properties. The senior Thompson claimed eminent domain through his political connections, But Jake had seen the fraudulent documents himself, stumbling upon them late one night in his father's study. The guilt gnawed at him as he watched the shoreline drift past, knowing what awaited the unsuspecting farmers. Mary Miller stood defiantly in front of her family's weathered farmhouse, her father Samuel beside her as the Thompson Company men approached. Jake hung back, shame burning in his chest as he witnessed the scene unfold. He'd grown up with Mary, back when the Miller's farm had been the source of fresh produce for the Thompson household. Now his father viewed their land as nothing more than a strategic shipping depot location. "Your father used to bounce you on his knee in our kitchen," Mary spat when she spotted Jake among the men. "Now you come to throw us off our land?" Her words struck deeper than any physical blow could have. Samuel Miller placed a restraining hand on his daughter's shoulder, but his eyes held the same bitter disappointment. Jake couldn't meet their gaze, turning away as the company men began their grim work. That night, unable to sleep, Jake slipped away from the River Queen and made his way to the hastily erected tent camp where the displaced families had gathered. He found Mary tending to elderly Elizabeth Davis, whose heart condition had worsened after being forced from her home. The lamplight cast harsh shadows across Mary's face as she looked up at his approach, her initial anger giving way to wary curiosity when she noticed he'd changed into simple work clothes. "I didn't know," Jake said softly, kneeling beside them. "I swear to you, Mary, I didn't know how far he'd go." He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket, documents proving the evictions were based on forged land titles. Mary's eyes widened as she scanned the papers, but her expression remained guarded. "Help me make this right," Jake pleaded. "We can fight this, but I need someone who knows these families, someone they trust." Over the next weeks, Jake began secretly funneling money and supplies to the displaced farmers while gathering evidence of his father's corruption. He recruited James Wilson, a sympathetic telegraph operator, to help intercept damaging communications between William Thompson and his network of bought officials. The risk of discovery grew with each passing day, but so did the network of resistance. Catherine Johnson, whose husband Thomas had been killed during the evictions, became their unexpected ally within Abilene itself. As owner of the town's busiest boarding house, she was perfectly positioned to gather intelligence from the rotating cast of Thompson Company men who lodged there. Her quiet strength and determination helped steady Jake's resolve whenever doubts crept in about betraying his father. The turning point came when William Thompson announced plans to dam a section of the river, which would flood thousands of acres of farmland upstream. Jake knew he could no longer work in secret. At a town meeting called to discuss the dam, he stood up and publicly denounced his father's actions, presenting evidence of the illegal evictions. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Mary Miller's voice, rising in support, followed by others until the hall erupted in calls for justice. William Thompson's face darkened with rage as he watched his son lead the charge against him. "You're no longer my heir," he declared coldly as he stormed from the meeting. "You're just another enemy to be dealt with." Jake felt the weight of his father's words, but standing beside Mary and the others, he knew he'd chosen the right path. The real battle was just beginning, and the fate of the river communities hung in the balance. Word spread quickly along the river network, carried by boats and riders to other communities facing similar threats. Emma Wilson, James's sister and a skilled rider, volunteered to carry messages between the growing pockets of resistance. The movement was gaining momentum, but William Thompson's reprisals grew increasingly violent as he fought to maintain control of his crumbling empire. The conflict escalated when Thompson's men attempted to sabotage several family-owned ferries that competed with his steamboat operations. Jake and Samuel Miller organized a volunteer patrol system, with armed farmers protecting the river crossings. The sight of former neighbors standing against each other highlighted how deeply the Thompson Empire had divided the once peaceful community. The morning fog clung to the river like a shroud as James studied the crude map spread across the Miller brothers' barn table. Red marks indicated where William Thompson's men had established blockades, choking off vital supply routes to the farming communities. Sarah, who'd been documenting the harassment of local traders, pointed to a narrow bend in the river where several boats had been turned back at gunpoint. Emma returned from her latest reconnaissance mission with troubling news. Thompson's forces had begun recruiting mercenaries from Silver City, offering generous bounties for anyone willing to help maintain order along the waterways. The hired guns brought a new level of ruthlessness to the conflict, caring nothing for the community ties that had once made violence unthinkable. Mary organized a network of riverwomen who gathered intelligence while delivering goods between settlements. Their seemingly innocent trading activities masked a sophisticated communication system that kept the resistance one step ahead of Thompson's patrols. Elizabeth, a skilled herbalist, used her regular rounds to pass coded messages hidden in medicine bottles. The situation reached a breaking point when Thompson's men seized the strategic ferry crossing at Fort Worth, effectively cutting off half the farming communities from their markets. Jake and Samuel proposed a bold plan to retake the crossing, but James knew it would mean directly confronting his father's authority for the first time. The weight of that decision kept him awake through several long nights. Catherine, whose family had operated riverboats for 3 generations, offered her fastest vessel for a daring operation. Under cover of darkness, they would slip past the blockade to deliver much-needed supplies to the isolated farmers. The risk was enormous. Thompson's men had orders to fire on any unauthorized boats, but desperation drove them forward. During the mission, James discovered documents revealing his father's larger scheme. William Thompson had been systematically buying up water rights throughout the territory, planning to control not just the trade routes but the very lifeblood of the region. The revelation transformed the conflict from a local dispute into something far more sinister. The resistance fighters established a hidden camp in a maze of river islands near Abilene, using the natural channels as corridors for their growing fleet of small boats. Thomas, an experienced river pilot, trained young men and women to navigate the treacherous waters blindfolded, preparing for nighttime operations. Word reached them that William Thompson had traveled to Tombstone to meet with powerful banking interests, seeking additional funding for his campaign against the farmers. James recognized several names on the guest list, men who'd dined at his family's table, whose sons he'd grown up with. The personal nature of the betrayal hardened his resolve. Each day brought new challenges. Thompson's mercenaries began burning crops along the riverbank, trying to starve out the resistance. The Miller brothers organized hunting parties to supplement dwindling food supplies, while Mary and Elizabeth worked tirelessly to preserve whatever provisions they could secure. The conflict took its toll on families and friendships. James watched former childhood companions choose sides, saw decades-old relationships crumble under the weight of economic pressure and divided loyalties. Emma's reconnaissance reports increasingly included names of people they'd once trusted, now turned informant for Thompson's gold. As autumn approached, bringing the threat of early frosts and harder times, the resistance fighters knew they needed a decisive victory. James developed a plan to strike at his father's economic foundation, targeting the corrupt network of banks and businesses that supported the Thompson Empire. The personal cost would be enormous, but the river community's survival hung in the balance. Their first major offensive would target the heavily guarded warehouse complex in Silver City, where Thompson stored both goods and incriminating documents. Sarah's careful intelligence work had revealed a weakness in the security routine, but exploiting it would require perfect timing and coordination between multiple resistance cells. The morning before the raid, James stood at the river's edge, watching the sun rise over the water that had shaped his family's destiny for generations. The same river that had built his father's empire would now become the pathway to its destruction, or perhaps its redemption. Everything depended on the choices they would make in the coming days. The summer sun beat mercilessly on Fort Worth as Jake Johnson watched his father's private army of hired guns surround the Miller family homestead. From his position on horseback atop a low ridge, he could see Sarah Miller defiantly standing on her porch, shotgun in hand, while her husband William tried reasoning with Thomas Thompson, his father's chief enforcer. Jake's stomach churned as he witnessed the scene unfolding. This wasn't about progress anymore, it was about power. Through his brass spyglass, Jake observed Thompson's characteristic sneer as he unrolled the eviction notice. The document bore his father, Samuel Johnson's flowing signature, the same signature that had appeared on Jake's Harvard acceptance letters and the deed to his first ranch. But now that signature represented something altogether different: the ruthless expansion of the Johnson Railroad Empire across the Texas frontier. The Miller homestead erupted in chaos as Thompson's men began dismantling fences and herding cattle. Jake's hands tightened on his reins as he watched William Miller take a rifle butt to the jaw. Sarah's screams carried across the distance as she was roughly restrained, their children huddled behind her skirts, tears streaming down their dust-covered faces. This was the moment Jake Johnson's world changed forever. Without conscious thought, Jake spurred his horse down the ridge. "Hold!" he shouted, his voice carrying authority earned through years as his father's heir apparent. Thompson's men hesitated, confused by the young railroad prince's intervention. Jake positioned his mount between the Millers and Thompson's thugs. "This ends now," he declared, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Your father's orders are clear, Mr. Johnson," Thompson drawled, his dead eyes fixing on Jake with predatory focus. "These squatters are impeding progress. The railroad's coming through, whether they like it or not." Behind him, Jake could hear Sarah Miller quietly sobbing as she tended to her husband's bloodied face. The sound hardened his resolve like steel in a forge. Word spread quickly along the river settlements. Samuel Johnson's son had turned against him, organizing resistance among the homesteaders. The Davis family offered their barn as a meeting place, and soon Jake found himself addressing dozens of desperate farmers. Elizabeth Davis, the family's eldest daughter, helped tend to the wounded Millers while plans were made. Her quiet strength became Jake's anchor in the storm that followed. Samuel Johnson's response was swift and terrible. The railroad's private army began burning crops and poisoning wells along the river. Each night, more refugees arrived at the Davis barn, bringing tales of destruction. Jake worked tirelessly, using his knowledge of his father's empire to predict movements and evacuate families before the raiders arrived. Elizabeth remained by his side, her practical wisdom tempering his righteous anger. The conflict escalated when James Wilson, a former Army captain who'd lost his land to the railroad, joined Jake's resistance. Wilson brought military discipline to their ragtag force, training farmers to fight and setting up an intelligence network through the river communities. More importantly, he helped Jake understand that this wasn't just about stopping his father. It was about changing the very nature of power in the territory. The turning point came when Thompson's men attacked the Davis farm in the dead of night. Jake and Wilson led the defense, their hastily trained farmers fighting with the desperation of men protecting their families. Elizabeth proved her mettle, organizing the women to treat wounded and keep ammunition flowing to the defenders. As dawn broke, Thompson's forces retreated, leaving their dead behind. The invincible railroad army had been bloodied. Samuel Johnson arrived personally the next day, his private train rolling into Fort Worth like an iron dragon. Jake met his father in the town square, decades of complex emotions roiling beneath his composed exterior. The elder Johnson's face was a mask of cold fury as he confronted the son who had become his greatest opponent. Their private war had become legend throughout the territory, dividing families and forcing everyone to choose sides. The confrontation drew crowds from miles around. Samuel Johnson offered his son one last chance at reconciliation: abandon the farmers, return to the fold, inherit an empire. Jake felt Elizabeth's presence behind him, heard Wilson cleaning his rifle, remembered the tears of Miller children. The choice was clear. "Your empire is built on suffering," Jake declared. "I choose to build something better." Shots rang out as Thompson's men, hidden in the crowd, opened fire. Jake's supporters returned fire, and the town square erupted in chaos. Through the smoke and screams, Jake saw his father retreating to his armored train car. Elizabeth pulled him to safety as Wilson's sharpshooters provided cover. The battle for Fort Worth had begun, and with it, the final chapter of the Johnson family legacy. The fighting raged for 3 days. Jake's farmers used their knowledge of the land, turning the river itself into a weapon by flooding railroad tracks and isolating Samuel Johnson's forces. Elizabeth coordinated supply lines through underground cellars and secret riverbank paths. Wilson's military expertise helped them counter Thompson's professional gunmen. Slowly, inevitably, the railroad's grip on Fort Worth began to slip. Samuel Johnson watched from his private car as his empire crumbled. His son had not only matched him in cunning, but had discovered something he never had: the power of people united by a cause greater than profit. When Thompson fell to a farmer's bullet, the remaining railroad men surrendered. The mighty Johnson Railroad Empire had been defeated not by a rival corporation, but by the very people it had tried to destroy. As dawn broke over Fort Worth, Jake Johnson stood before his father's private railcar, his shadow long against the blood-orange horizon. The morning air carried the metallic scent of gunpowder mixed with river mist, while farmers and former railroad men alike tended to their wounded. Elizabeth worked tirelessly among them, her once fine dress now stained with the grim reality of their struggle. Samuel Johnson emerged from his car without his usual commanding presence. Age and defeat had finally caught up with the railroad baron, his shoulders bearing the weight of his crumbled empire. Father and son faced each other in silence, their shared features marked by exhaustion and the bitter taste of family torn asunder. The river flowing behind them seemed to pause, holding its breath for what would come next. "You've won, Jake," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying none of its former thunder. "But what you've destroyed was built by your grandfather's hands." Thomas Johnson laid these tracks with dreams of connecting people, not dividing them. Jake felt the weight of those words, remembering childhood stories of his grandfather's vision for the railroad. Elizabeth approached, carrying documents recovered from Thompson's office, evidence of land theft, forged deeds, and orchestrated violence against the farming families. She placed them in Jake's hands, her presence giving him strength. "Grandfather's dream didn't include crushing the very people he meant to serve," Jake responded, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. The gathered crowd watched as Jake unfolded the papers, years of corruption laid bare in ink and paper. Samuel's eyes widened as he saw the extent of Thompson's dealings, actions taken without his full knowledge, but under his implicit authority. The realization of how far his empire had strayed from Thomas Johnson's original vision struck him like a physical blow. Along the riverbank, Mary and Catherine organized the farmers' families as they emerged from their hiding places, children wide-eyed at the sight of the smoking remnants of battle. The water carried away debris from the flooding, nature already beginning to heal the scars of human conflict. Wilson's men helped disarm the remaining railroad guards, treating them with a dignity that spoke of victory without vengeance. "There's a way forward," Jake said, stepping closer to his father. "Not through force, but partnership. The farmers need the railroad, and the railroad needs their crops." Grandfather understood that balance. Elizabeth produced a new document, a charter for a cooperative that would give farming families fair representation in railroad operations and pricing. Samuel took the charter with trembling hands, his empire's transformation written in careful legal text. The document proposed a shared governance between railroad interests and agricultural representatives, with profits divided fairly and transparent operations. It was everything Thomas Johnson had originally envisioned, before greed had twisted his dream. As father and son stood together reviewing the charter, the morning sun fully emerged, casting long shadows of the railroad tracks across the land. These iron lines that had once divided them could now serve as bridges between communities. Elizabeth organized a meeting between farmer representatives and railroad officials, beginning the delicate work of rebuilding trust. In the following days, Fort Worth transformed. The Johnson Railroad offices became headquarters for the new cooperative, with Elizabeth's legal expertise helping forge agreements that protected both sides. Jake worked tirelessly to implement fair practices, while Samuel, humbled but not broken, contributed decades of railroad knowledge to the new enterprise. The river trade flourished under the new arrangement, with farmers getting fair rates for shipping and the railroad maintaining profitable operations. Wilson stayed on as head of security, ensuring that the peace won through blood would be maintained through justice. The Johnson legacy was not destroyed but reborn, returning to the honorable principles upon which it was founded. As summer turned to fall, Jake and Elizabeth stood on the balcony of the cooperative's headquarters, watching boats laden with grain moving downriver while trains whistled in the distance. Samuel Johnson had taken a seat on the cooperative's board, his experience tempered now by wisdom and humility. The family name would continue, but it would stand for something greater than mere profit. It would represent the triumph of unity over division, of justice over power. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy streets of Fort Worth as Jake Thompson rode into town at the head of over 200 farmers and homesteaders. His father William's private security force had barricaded themselves inside the railroad office, their rifles glinting from upper windows. The tension that had been building for months was about to reach its breaking point. Sarah Miller watched from the doorway of her general store, her heart heavy with worry. She had seen how this conflict had torn apart not just the Thompson family, but the entire region. As Jake's closest confidant and childhood friend, she understood better than most the weight he carried on his shoulders, forced to choose between his father's empire and the common people he'd grown to champion. Inside the railroad office, William Thompson paced anxiously, his normally commanding presence diminished by exhaustion and disbelief. His most trusted advisor, Samuel Davis, stood quietly by the window. "Your son has united them all," Samuel observed. "The farmers from Silver City, The rivermen from Abilene, even the miners from Tombstone. They're here for more than just land now. They believe in him. The farmers had strategically positioned wagons to block every escape route, their determination evident in their grim faces. These weren't the same scattered families that William's men had so easily evicted months ago. Under Jake's leadership, they had become an organized force, using the river networks to coordinate their resistance and share resources. Elizabeth Wilson, the widow whose eviction had first opened Jake's eyes to his father's ruthless methods, now stood proudly among the protest leaders. Her small daughter Catherine clutched a rag doll as she watched from a safe distance, too young to fully comprehend how her family's tragedy had sparked this momentous confrontation. Mary Johnson, the telegraph operator who had secretly helped Jake warn communities about incoming eviction parties, worked furiously at her machine. She was spreading word of the standoff to newspapers across the territory, ensuring that whatever happened today would not go unreported. The Thompson Railroad Empire's reputation hung by a thread. Thomas Miller, Sarah's father, and the town's most respected merchant, emerged from his store with a white flag. As a man who had done business with both sides, he had volunteered to mediate. "William," he called out, "your son wants to talk. No weapons, no tricks, just a father and son finding a way forward." Jake dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and calm despite the dozens of rifles trained on him. He had changed from the impetuous heir who once lived for his father's approval. Months of fighting for justice, of seeing families rebuild their lives on land he had helped them reclaim, had transformed him into a leader in his own right. William Thompson appeared on the office balcony, his silver hair catching the morning light. For a moment, father and son locked eyes across the distance, each seeing the other clearly for perhaps the first time. The old railroad baron recognized the same steel in his son's gaze that had driven him to build his empire, but tempered with something he had lost long ago: compassion. The negotiation lasted through the day and into the night. Terms were proposed, rejected, and revised. The future of the railroad, the rights of the homesteaders, and the very nature of progress in the West hung in the balance. Emma Davis, Samuel's wife and the town's schoolteacher, kept careful records of every agreement reached. As dawn broke the next morning, a new charter was signed. The Thompson Railroad would continue to expand, but along routes agreed upon by elected community councils. Fair compensation would be guaranteed for any displaced families, and a portion of profits would fund schools and public works. It wasn't a complete victory for either side, but it was something more valuable: a sustainable peace. Jake and William stood together on the balcony as the crowd dispersed, their relationship forever altered but not destroyed. "You fought well, son," William said quietly. "Better than I did." Jake nodded, understanding that in his father's own way, this was both apology and praise. "We both did what we thought was right," he replied. "Now we have to prove we can build something better together." The story of the Thompson Railroad War became legend throughout the territory, not for its violence but for how it ended. It marked the beginning of a new era, where progress and justice didn't have to be enemies. Sarah Miller would later write in her journal that she saw both Thompson men smile that morning. Not the triumphant grins of winners, but the relieved expressions of men who had found their way back to being family. In the years that followed, Fort Worth flourished under the new arrangement. The river trade boomed as farmers and merchants worked together, their interests finally aligned. Jake and Sarah married the following spring, their union symbolizing the bridge built between the old power structures and the new order. William Thompson, to everyone's surprise, became a passionate advocate for responsible development. Catherine Wilson grew up to become the first woman to serve on the railroad's community council, carrying forward the legacy of change that had begun with her family's story. The Thompson name, once feared, became associated with a different kind of strength: the power to admit mistakes and work toward something greater than profit alone. The transformation of Fort Worth continued well into the 1890s, as the ripple effects of the Thompson family's reconciliation spread throughout the region. The old railroad office, once a symbol of corporate might, was converted into a community meeting hall where farmers and merchants gathered monthly to discuss fair trade practices. Jake Thompson, having earned the respect of both sides, often mediated these discussions from the same desk where his father had once plotted land acquisitions. Sarah's influence on Jake helped soften the harder edges of his personality, though he never lost the fierce determination that had driven him to stand up against injustice. Their home became a gathering place for progressive thinkers and community leaders, with Sarah's garden parties serving as informal planning sessions for the region's continued development. The couple had two children who grew up understanding both the weight of the Thompson name and the responsibility it now carried. William Thompson, in his later years, found an unexpected passion in agricultural innovation. He funded research into drought-resistant crops and irrigation techniques, working alongside the very farmers he had once sought to displace. The old man would often sit on his porch overlooking the river, telling his grandchildren stories about how their father had taught him the true meaning of legacy. Catherine Wilson's role on the Railroad Council proved transformative. She established education programs for farmers' children and created a cooperative lending system that helped smaller operations survive tough seasons. The Wilson family farm, once nearly lost to foreclosure, became a model of modern farming practices, hosting delegations from as far as Abilene and Silver City. The river trade routes that had once been controlled by a select few now operated under a charter of fair practices, drafted jointly by merchant associations and farming cooperatives. The Thompson Shipping Company, under Jake's leadership, implemented a sliding scale of rates that ensured even the smallest farms could get their goods to market. During the drought of '95, this system proved crucial in keeping the community afloat. Mary Thompson, Jake's mother, lived to see her family's redemption complete. In her final years, she established a foundation to support education for farmers' children, ensuring that the next generation would have opportunities beyond the fields. The Mary Thompson Scholarship became a stepping stone for many young minds who would later contribute to the region's prosperity. The old conflicts weren't forgotten, but they were transformed into cautionary tales and teaching moments. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, the community gathered to celebrate not just the bounty of the land, but the hard-won peace that had made it possible. Jake and William Thompson would stand together, their past differences dissolved in the warmth of family and community bonds. Elizabeth Carter, one of the original homesteaders who had stood with Jake during the resistance, became the town's historian. Her detailed accounts of the transformation from conflict to cooperation were preserved in the Fort Worth Library, serving as a reminder that change, though difficult, was possible when people chose dignity over pride and community over profit. As the century drew to a close, Fort Worth had become a model for other river communities struggling with similar conflicts. Delegations from Tombstone and other territorial towns sought advice on balancing progress with preservation, often returning home with lessons learned from the Thompson family's journey. The river that had once divided interests now connected communities united in purpose. Jake and Sarah's children grew up understanding that true strength lay not in power over others, but in the ability to bring people together. The Thompson name, which had once represented the unstoppable force of progress at any cost, became synonymous with thoughtful development and community stewardship. The legacy that Jake had once fought to change had been transformed into something his own children could carry forward with pride.